Okay, for this video, I'm going to create a simple layout. What you have before you is a Dreamweaver document that I created, and I've also attached an empty style sheet. I can see that it is attached right here, so I'm all ready to go. Okay, I'm going to start adding divs. As a reminder, divs are basically boxes. And going back to the definition from the W3 school, a div is a container or a box for HTML elements, which can include in paragraphs, images, and so forth, which can be styled or manipulated with JavaScript. We're not to this part yet, the JavaScript, but we are at the HTML elements. Okay, you have a few different types of these boxes that you can add. Under the Insert menu, I can do a generic div that doesn't have an identifier. However, I can add a class name to identify this div from any other divs on my page. But you also have ones that have semantic names, like a box called header, a box called navigation, and so forth. Now, the first one is very generic, so you have to add a class name so you can identify it. When they added or updated to HTML5, they had noted that so many people were creating divs that they gave a name of header, navigation, and so forth with. They came up with unique boxes that had semantic names. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go Insert Div. You want to give your div a class name so you can target this div from other divs, so you can give it unique styling. And what I'm going to do is call it container, and this is going to be the div or the box that I'm going to nest other divs in. So it's going to be kind of the parent div, and I'm going to say OK. And there it is, and I get some filler text. If I look in code view, I can see this div, the div I entered, has a unique name of container. So I can style this div different than any other divs that I'm going to add because this is the name of the div. Another way to say it would be if I had a room full of students and I wanted one student to do something specific, rather than talk to all the students in the class, I would have to use the student's name to identify or target that particular student. So the class name targets this div, so I can give it unique styling from any other divs I potentially add to the page later. When you add that div, you get some filler text here. And basically what's happening here is this filler text is actually bracing this open. If I didn't have any text in here, you wouldn't even see a height. So the height here is actually based on the text or the content. All right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to nest other HTML elements or boxes within this div. So this is going to be the parent div. And so I'm going to click right after the word here in code view, and I'm going to drive that end of that div down. Okay? And I'm going to put other boxes inside. Now the next one I'm going to add under the Insert menu is header. This is a semantic box. It's basically a div, but it's got a unique name already. So I'm going to do header. I don't need to give it a class name because it already has a name. So I'm going to say OK. Okay, the next thing I'm going to add is a navigation box or section. So after the end of the header tag, I'm looking right here. In code view, I'm going to hit the return key just to give me some space in code view. A browser will ignore any spaces. So what I'm going to do is go Insert, and I'm going to choose Navigation. Okay, now if I'm going to have more than one navigation bar, I probably want to give it a class name so I can target individual navigation bars. But in this case, I'm just going to have one navigation bar. So I'm going to say OK. All right, and the tag I get is nav. Okay, I'm going to enter another one. So I'm after the end of the nav tag, and I'm hitting the return key in code view. I'm going to put my cursor in between, and I'm going to go Insert, and now I have a choice between main, aside. Aside is basically a sidebar, article, section, and then you have a footer. Now, main, aside, and article and section. It's all going to depend on how you want to organize your content. They're basically just boxes that have names. And I'm going to add, in this case, I'll add a section. And if I'm going to have multiple sections, I'm going to want to give it a class name so I can target and style the sections differently. In this case, for the simple layout, I'm just going to say okay and not give it a class name, and I get the section tag. Now, after the section tag, I'm in code view. I'm going to hit the return key again, and this time I'll do an aside. So I can have a section maybe on the left hand side of my page, and I can have an aside or a sidebar on the right hand side. So I'm going to go insert, and this time I'm going to choose aside. Again, it stands for a sidebar, and I'm going to say aside. If I have multiple sidebars, I'd want to give it a class name, but in this case I'm not going to. I'm just going to say okay. After the aside, I'm going to hit the return key again, and this time I'm going to enter a footer. So I'm going to go insert footer. And again, I'm not going to have multiple footers on a page, and I'm not going to style them differently, so I don't need to give it an additional name. So I'm just going to say okay. Now, if I look in code view, I've got a header, nav, a section, an aside, and a footer, and they're all nested in this div called container. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to preview my page in the browser. So I'm coming down to the lower right hand corner, and I'm going to click Safari. To preview in Safari, it's asking me to save, so I'll go ahead and save, and I can see just the placeholder text in these boxes that I created, or divisions. All right. Okay, I also want to note that these boxes, these divisions, these sections, go all the way across the page. Keep in mind they're invisible. We can change the size of these boxes using cascading style sheet rules. So we're going to do that in the CSS Designer next. Okay, so I'm going to open up the CSS Designer. I'm going to put my cursor right in div class equals container. I've got my CSS style sheet already linked to, and I'm going to add a selector. Okay, so the selector was added with the class name here, and I'm going to go into the background colors, and I'm just going to pick a gray. Okay, now since this container, this class equals container, is the parent of all these, all the children, these would be considered children, take on the same attribute. If we want them to look different, we have to actually format these individually. So I'm going to go ahead and select header. I'm going to add a selector for it, and it says, oh, you want to stylize the header that's in the class container, and I do, and I'm just going to give it a color. Doesn't matter what color, just so you can see it. And now I can see the header has been stylized. Now I'm going to do the nav. It's much easier to select these in code view, and I'm going to add a selector for the nav. Okay, there it is, and I'm just going to give them background colors so you can see them a bit better. So I'm going to go to the background properties and just pick a random color. And there we go. I can see that it was stylized. I'm going to go ahead and do the section. I'm going to add a selector for it. Again, I'm just going to give it a background color. So I'm going to the background properties, and I'll pick just another random color. There we go. I'm going to do the aside. I'm putting my cursor right here, and I'm going to add the selector. There it is, and I'm going to choose another color. I'm going to the yellow this time, and there's the color. Now I'm going to do the footer, clicking right here. I'm going to add the selector and give it a color. I'll do a darker red. Okay, now I'm going to move the CSS Designer out of the way, and you can see now that all these boxes have color. Now I'm going to go back to the CSS Designer, and I'm going to do more formatting to the container. Again, this is the parent container, and all these other ones are nested inside, so they're considered children. Now, when I format this one, since these are children, they should all basically obey the parent. What do I mean by that? Let me show you. So I'm going to go to the CSS Designer, I'm going to go to the container, and I'm going to go to the layout properties, and I'm going to specify a width. So I'm going to do pixels, and just for demonstration purposes, I will do 1000 pixels. Okay. And now when I do that, all the children take on that same formatting. So they're all 1000. So let me preview that in the web. Okay, now I can see the colors because I added colors, and all the children are basically obeying the parent. They're taking on the same width. Now, if I want them to be different, I need to stylize them individually, meaning if I need them to be different widths, I have to target them individually. Okay, back in the CS Designer, what I want to do is I want to make the header taller, or I want to give it more height. So what I'm going to do is target or create a rule for the header. I'm going to go into the layout properties. In height, in the height area, I'm going to say pixels, and I'm going to give it a height of 100. And the return key, and I can see now the header is 100. I don't need to specify a height for the container because it is actually going to grow based upon what's inside of it at this point. And what's inside it is the header, the nav, the section, the aside, and the footer. All right, next I want to do the nav. So I'm going to select the nav selector. I'm going to go to the layout properties, and I'm going to give it a height. Usually nav bars aren't very high, so I'm going to do pixels, and I'll give it a height of 50 pixels. Okay, and I can see the change take place. I'm going to go to the section, and I'm going to give it a height, pixels, and maybe I'll make it 400. Okay, now I can see the section is now 400. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the aside. So I'm going to select the aside selector, and I'm going to go to height, pixels, and I'll make it 400 as well, because eventually I'm going to have the aside and the section sitting next to each other. Okay, so there it is. Now I'll do the footer. I'm going to select this selector, the footer selector, and give it a height. Usually footers aren't that high, so I will do, maybe I'll do 30. And hit my return key, and I can see that it is 30. Let me preview in the web and say yes. Okay, so right now I've got my header, my nav, my section, my aside, and footer. They each have a height attribute that I added to them, and they're taking on the width from the container, or they're inheriting that attribute. If I want to make them a different width, I have to target them. Very much like if you had a family and you were all, your mother and dad had red hair, most likely the kids are going to have red hair. They inherit that attribute. If a child wants a different color hair, they have to do something specific, like dye their hair blue to overwrite the inheritance that they get from their parent. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify a specific width for the section. So I'm going to select the selection. Again, that's this one right here, this big purple one, and I'm going to give it a width. And I'll give it a width of 500. Again, the overall container is 1,000. So I want to do half of that. And when I do that, I can see that the width has changed. Now I'm going to come down to the aside and do the same thing. Okay, I'm in the aside, and I'm going to give it a width of 500. Okay, if I move the CSS Designer out of the way, I can see that now the section and the aside are 500. And note that the aside does not slip up and occupy this space, even though it's 500 and 500 and the overall container is 1000. In order for the aside to slip up here, I have to take these boxes out of their default behavior. And to do that, what I'm going to do is tell them to float, either left or right. I'm going to tell the section to float left, and I'm going to tell the aside to float to the right. Okay, so what I'm going to do is do the section. I'm in the layout properties, and I'm going to tell it to float left. Before I click it, notice what's going to happen to the yellow aside. It's going to disappear. Okay, when I do that, again, it takes it out of its default behavior, and now the aside doesn't even see it anymore. It's not even, as far as the aside is concerned, the section no longer exists. Okay, now I'm going to do the side, and I'm going to float it to the right. So if I move the CSS Designer out of the way, I now see that they are sitting side by side. But what happened to the footer? The footer disappeared as well. The footer is actually up here. When you float something, the other elements will rise up as though these elements are no longer part of the layout. So what I have to do is tell the footer to ignore these floats. So and that would be, in the footer, it's basically too clear. And I'm going to clear both the right and left floats. Clear. When I do that, the footer then appears. Let me go ahead and preview in the web. Safari and save. And there's a basic layout. You can imagine where you could put maybe an image in the header, a navigation bar, you could put body text and something in a sidebar and add content for the footer. Okay? Now what I'm going to do is I am going to center this whole layout. To center the layout, right now it's up against the left edge. If I want it to center in the browser, I have to target the container. Again, the container is the parent element. If I center it, all the children will also center. So let me do that. And this is going to be something you have to memorize because it's not necessarily intuitive what you have to do. I'm going to go to the container, and what I'm going to do in the margin, left and right, I'm going to change it to auto. The next one to auto. So it's automatically going to figure out the spacing left and right. So if I close the CSS Designer, I can see the layout is centered. Let me go ahead and look at that in the browser. It's centered. What I had to do is in the margin area for the container, I had to say auto right, auto left. Now the container, the only reason I have this container is to wrap around these children. So what I don't even really need this extra text here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of the text. Notice that when I get rid of the text, okay, you're not even going to see the gray anymore because it's being braced open by this text. So if I click, it's gone. It's still there, except there's no filler text to brace it open. Okay, just to prove to you that the container box is still there, wrapped around these other elements, what I'm going to do is take the color off the section. When I do that, you will see the gray background that we gave the container. So let me open up my CSS Designer. I'm going to go to the section and I'm going to go to the background properties and I'm going to delete them. When I do that, I can see the gray background of the container. I could do the same thing to the footer, get rid of that color, and there we go. One of the benefits of having a container element wrapped around your other elements is you don't have to always specify a width. Any element you add inside it will automatically take on the container's width unless you want to have it different like we did with the section and the aside. So it actually saves on more coding because all the elements will take on the attributes or inherit the width of the container.